working. Okay. My remote's not working, but we're going to look at the Constitution. Now, some of this, just so we understand, some of this is going to be mildly redundant. Actually, some of it's going to be heavily redundant to some of the stuff that we did a week ago when we were looking at the Declaration and the Constitution. But some of it I'm going to go back through because it does genuinely matter to me, and I want to make sure that we touch on it again to make sure that we get it right. Now, we talked about last week. We talked about the difference between the Constitution and the Declaration. We know that the Declaration is a very philosophical document, right? It's a document that sort of outlines the rationale for government, how it ought to function, what are the responsibilities of the people, what are the responsibilities of the government, right? And then we have a long list of reasons or sort of means of how the King of England is in violation of those ideological principles, yes? The Constitution, on the other hand, is a legal document. It is law and it is structure. Okay? The closest thing that the Constitution has to any sort of philosophical ideals, it shows up here in the preamble with the basic purposes of what we're trying to do, right? Promote general tranquility, establish justice, yada, yada, yada. Okay? But it is worth noting that those are the general goals of this document that we are creating. Okay? Now, I'll skip through a lot of this history stuff because it's more for an on-level government, like an on-level high school class, and I just don't care that much. But I do want to make sure that I touch on this point because one of the things that we will talk about in this class over and over and over again as we move through is we're going to talk about culture. Because the longer and longer I've been teaching, the more and more I think that culture matters immensely, right? And the more when I say culture matters immensely, we have a problem in the United States culturally, right? And that's not to say that American culture is problematic so much as it is to say that there is not a singular American culture. Okay, that's really the issue. The more cultures that we have, right, ideological ways of like looking at the world and thinking about how things ought to be, the more viewpoints that you have to take into account when creating a government, and that becomes problematic. Okay, but I do want you to at least understand, and I don't know how well this is taught to you in U.S. history class, when the country is founded in 1776, like literally when we sign the Declaration and we tell the king we're out, right? There's not a unified culture. Like, I need you to understand that the 13 colonies are not like one nation, one state, one ideal, one way of thinking. And the people of Boston and the people of Charleston, South Carolina are drastically different. They're culturally different, right? They're economically different. There's differences even in religion or things of that nature. And what the Constitution does, though, is it figures out a way to bring these different interests together and create one uniform national government that is capable of handling all of those variations and all of that deviance that is occurring. Okay? So I want you to understand what that means is we're not beyond hope, right? I genuinely believe that. I'm actually, you'll be surprised by the time we get to December. I am an optimist, right? I'm going to tell you a lot of things that sound really pessimistic, but that's just because the current path is pessimistic. I think we can change. I do. Probably why I had a lot of failed relationships in my youth. Thought people could change, right? I don't care about this. I do want to at least mention the Stamp Act, only because I think it's a really good indicator. I'm not going to test you on it, right? But I think it's a really good indicator or a way of understanding sort of governmental thinking, specifically as it pertains to taxation, right? So we should know from our basic understanding of American history, right, that the I can't think. The whole no taxation without representation. Yes, like taxes was an issue. Not the only issue. Make no mistake. Make no mistake whatsoever. Not the only issue that we had, right? We had other issues. And there were excuse me, there were a whole bunch of taxes. But the Stamp Act is really interesting because I think it's a very good indicator of how governments create taxes. Right? Because ideally, government needs to maximize its tax revenue, right? Meaning it needs to maximize the amount of money that it can get off of taxes. So it's got to figure out ways to put taxes into place that people will actually pay, right? If, let's just say for the sake of argument, the government were to create some sort of sin tax on like vapes today, right? Or cigarettes or alcohol. That's what a sin tax is, right? It's a tax on something that is deemed like immoral within society. Okay, well, if I don't want to pay those taxes, guess what? I just don't buy those products, right? That's a really good tool that governments have to try to like dictate behaviors or mandate the way people act in certain situations, but it's not a very good way of raising revenue. Okay, and that's obviously what the British government is trying to do at this point because they're trying to pay off their war debt from the War of 1763, the French and Indian War, right? 7 Years' War if you're in Europe. Okay? But ultimately, what the Stamp Act is it is not it's not a tax on postage, which when I was young, that's what kids thought because people back then used to buy these things called stamps. Yeah, I don't know if I'm being funny or not. Do we know what stamps are? Have we mailed an actual like? Okay, I'm glad you know what stamps are. How many of you have purchased stamps personally? Okay, yeah, not very many, right? Right. What the Stamp Act does is it really is a tax, essentially, for lack of a better term, on paper products or contractual obligations, right? And so here's what I want you to understand, right? Like if Mason and I are engaged in some sort of contractual agreement, he's going to provide a service and I'm going to pay him for it, right? So I'm the buyer, he's the seller. We're going to have a contract. Which one of us wants to make sure that that contract is valid? So maybe the buyer so they can get their money's worth, maybe the seller because they need to make sure they get their money, right? Well, you're absolutely right. A seller does want to make sure that contract is valid so that they get paid what they agreed to get paid for, right? But the buyer also wants the contract to be valid because they want to make sure that they get the product that they were paying for. The reality is both sides want contracts. That's why contracts exist, right? Both sides are protected. Okay? So the very fact that you have a tax now on sort of these contractual agreements, right, stamping and saying, hey, this is valid, this is real, this is enforceable, both sides are sort of willing to overcome that, right? Ultimately, if only one side wanted it, the other side's like, well, I'm not paying for the Stamp Act. I'm not paying the tax. I don't want that. I don't care. Okay? It's a way for governments to ensure that they're taxing in a manner that's going to maximize their revenues. Okay? So we get to the we get to 1776 and we get to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? And like we said, the Declaration is highly philosophical. It's talking about why government ought to exist, right? What the general state of nature and nature's God is, and how people are born, and what people's obligations are, and what government's obligations are to people, right? And then how the king has sort of violated these basic like ideals. Okay. And so we remember when we read the Declaration, right? Step one, when government's not going very well, what's the very first thing that you do? Alter it, right? Can't alter it, then we abolish it. Once we've abolished it, then we have to immediately set up a new government. We're obligated to set up a new government, right? And so what does the United States do? It sets up a new government. This is the Articles of Confederation, and this we did not talk about last week. Okay? First of all, do we know what a confederation is? Maybe, no, not exactly. Okay? So, if we went back and we looked at the Declaration of Independence, one of the fascinating things that I find in the Declaration of Independence is that in the actual document, when you look at it, right, it says, you know, Declaration of the United States of America, right? United is not capitalized, States is capitalized. Okay, what does that mean? Do we know how capitalization works? I'm not trying to be like funny or take you to like elementary English, right? Campbell, who is this person right here? No, that's what that says. Who is that person? Tell me who it is. Is this a specific human being? It is? Which specific human being is this? Okay, it's your dad? Okay, fine. Who's this? There you go. That's the key. Okay? And I want you to understand that. That's the key, right? That lowercase d, that just means any dad, right? So United States, United lowercase, States uppercase. Okay? Those states are unique, independent, autonomous entities. Okay? And what a confederation really does is it takes a bunch of independent, autonomous countries, okay, and it puts them together for some sort of common purpose. Okay? And this is actually one of the reasons why I would argue, and this is now just a personal argument, I would tell you that confederations are kind of foolish. Okay? I actually think confederations are phenomenal if implemented correctly, but I think they're very rarely implemented correctly. Okay? So when we say confederation, we say autonomous states, right, or countries, that's another word for states, okay, that are going to be joined together for some common purpose. So what could these common purposes be? What type of common purposes are we looking at?
Like reasons to rebel, reasons to like strengthen numbers.
Okay, so defense,
Yeah.
right? That might be a common purpose. Okay, we're gonna defend one another so that we're stronger together, right? If England comes back and attacks Massachusetts again, Virginia is going to take up arms and go defend Massachusetts. Okay, do we know what NATO is? Yes, we learned that in U.S. history, right? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay, NATO, just so we're crystal clear, right? If Russia were to invade Germany tomorrow, right? Actually, let's go September 1st, just for funsies, right? Isn't that when Germany invaded Poland? Wasn't it September 1st? I don't remember the date. It was in September. Whatever. Okay? If Russia invades Germany, okay, today, tomorrow, whatever, what happens? What happens in the United States? We go to war. NATO requires us to go and defend Germany against foreign aggression in Russia. Is NATO a confederation? No. It's just a treaty organization. This is why confederations are ultimately sort of foolish, right? Because NATO doesn't have a Congress, for instance, right? I mean, sort of, but not really. Okay, like there's like a organization that sort of oversees NATO, and ensures that the countries are like semi working together and whatnot. But like they don't have a ton of authority, right? On the other hand, let's look at the United Nations. Is the United Nations a confederation? Yes. We have a bunch of independent countries, right? Right? Does the UN have a government? They actually kind of do. They meet in New York City, right? But they have what's called the General Assembly, right? Every country sends a UN ambassador, right? They represent that nation. They pass resolutions and they're like, hey, we should do this and we need to worry about climate change and child labor in like lithium mines in Africa or cobalt mines in Asia, where I don't know where they mine that sort of stuff, right? But like all of the mining that has to happen for these EV batteries that we need, right? And we have to worry about child labor and slave labor and female genocide, and also the UN is concerned about all sorts of things. Yes, and so it passes these resolutions in their little legislative body. And we think back to what we learned in 8th grade, 4th grade, whatever, right? We know Congress makes the laws. Yes, the UN has a legislative body. They can make resolutions, right? The president enforces the laws. Does the UN have a president? And a secretary general who oversees the legislative body. So when the UN passes a resolution, right, that says, hey, no child labor in diamond mines in Africa, who enforces that? Well, I mean, some of the nations might choose to enforce it. What if I'm the president of the United States and I'm like, we're a little strapped for cash this month, man. I'm not helping. I can't help you there in Africa regulating those diamond mines. Can the UN do anything to me? It's ultimately what makes confederation sort of worthless, and specifically this confederation, because that's ultimately what happens, right? Is we have this legislative body under the Articles of Confederation, and if they could get something done, and mind you, they can't because you need unanimous consent, and you can, I mean, y'all understand how hard unanimous consent is? I can't get all of America to believe that the Earth is round because we have people like Kyrie Irving who went to Duke. He thinks the Earth's flat. I mean, maybe. I don't know. He's walked that statement back in years. I don't want to get, since this is going to go on YouTube, I don't want to get sued by Kyrie Irving. He's walked that statement back. I don't know. It's just a joke. Okay. But you understand, I can't get everybody to agree on anything, right? So that's really, really hard. Even if we get everybody to agree at the congressional level under the Articles of Confederation, and when it goes back to the state and the state government goes, yeah, we're not doing that, what do we do? Like, do you know what happens when Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine? Like, what does the UN do then? Well, charities ought to be doing that, not governments. I mean, funds, like resources, maybe not troops, right? But funds and resources. Like, oh, the Ukrainians need blankets and food. That's why charity exists, right? But here's the thing, even let's just say for the sake of argument, the UN was then going to pass some sort of resolution that sanctioned Russia. Could they do that? Sanctions are just where you prevent, like, Russia's got a lot of oil, right? We're not going to let Russia sell oil places. Could we do that? Except Russia's going to veto it. I mean, literally, the most that the UN can do is write a letter to Putin to be like, sir, that was not very nice, and you should go home because you're hurting those poor people. So please leave because you're just being mean. So please go home. And that letter will never even reach Putin because the Russian ambassador to the UN will veto it. We're not doing that. Putin doesn't care that you think he's being mean. Okay? The Articles of Confederation is, in fact, just so we understand, it's so impractical, it's so weak, it's so pointless, it's so dang near pathetic, right? That like it only lasts a few years. Right? And then in 1787, we have to write the Constitution. Literally, 1776, we claimed to be independent, right? When does the American Revolutionary War end? Do we know? I mean, obviously, it does not end before 1776, right? Did it end on July 4th, 1776? No, of course not. That's just when we declared our independence. We then had to fight for it and get England to agree, which doesn't happen until 1781. So the reality is we're not really a country until 1781. And then by 1786, just 5 years later, we're like, hey, that government that we just made is no good, right? Take two. This is one of the reasons why rough drafts matter. The reality is the Articles of Confederation is, on some level, a rough draft to the Constitution. It is a first attempt at self-governance amongst the people, and it fails spectacularly. Okay, so all of this we covered last week, right? We know that once we go to the convention, we got to figure out representation. We have the Virginia plan, we have the Jersey plan, large state, small state. We end up with the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, right? Bicameral legislature, one chamber based on population, that's the House, one based upon equal representation, that's the Senate. We know that we're going to count black people or slaves, specifically slaves, as 3/5 of the human being. Okay, both for the purposes of taxation and for the purposes of representation. Okay. So now we get into the actual structure. Article 1, like we talked about last week, is the legislative article. This is going to create the House and the Senate. Okay. This is going to be the longest of all of our articles. It takes up almost or roughly 50% of the original 7 articles of the Constitution. Okay. This will outline all of the powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8, all of the expressed powers of Congress. Well, most of the express powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8, right? Congress shall have the power to, and then we just name a whole bunch of different things that Congress is going to be able to do. Okay? It is worth understanding that there is a difference between expressed powers and implied powers, right? Those expressed powers are the ones specifically stated in the Constitution. The implied powers are the ones that are not necessarily stated, well, not necessarily, not stated, right, but are deemed to be both necessary and proper in order for Congress to carry out its expressed powers. And we talked about the National Bank being an example of such, right? Now, again, if you read the Federalist Papers in more detail, this becomes somewhat alarming and concerning, okay, because I'd have to go back and look at my own notes to see exactly which Federalist paper it is. But in one of the Federalist papers, Alexander Hamilton basically says we don't need a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is unnecessary because the government is not allowed to do anything we didn't expressly say that they could do, which causes this to be problematic. Okay, but that's going to be an expansion of powers over the course of time. Article 2 is the executive branch. Okay, now again, we're just talking about how things are initially set up. Okay, we're talking about the structure of the Constitution. This is roughly a quarter of the Constitution. That means that the Congress is the most powerful entity. President would be the second most powerful entity. And it's worth noting that a whole bunch of the powers that we outline in Article 2 to the president actually require some level of interaction, engagement, or approval from the Senate. Right? President negotiates treaties, but the Senate approves. President appoints justices, but the Senate approves. President appoints ambassadors, but the Senate approves. Right? President has the authority to veto legislation, but Congress can override that veto with a supermajority. Right? Fair number of checks placed upon the individual in power. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Article 3 is the Supreme Court. It is worth understanding. Nowhere in the Constitution, hear me when I tell you this, nowhere in the Constitution does the term judicial review exist. But again, Is judicial review a foundational principle in this country? The answer is yes. It's in the Federalist Papers. The idea of judicial review is in the Federalist Papers. And so if we read the Federalist Papers, which is what advocated in favor of the Constitution, and we apply it to the Constitution, then we ought to know that, yes, this is a permissible behavior. Okay? Article 5 is basically some clauses that allow for some level of, for lack of a better term, unity. Right? Everybody in here have a driver's license? Yes? Okay. Are you allowed to drive in Louisiana, Lauren? Yes, ma'am, you can. I mean, think about this. Yeah, you're like, wait, man, can I? If you're on a road trip, you don't have to stop when you get to the Louisiana state line and then like go find a Louisiana cop and be like, hey, I need special permission to drive in your state as well. No. Okay, that's what's called full faith and credit clause, right? You have credit for it here, they're going to give you credit for it there. Same concept, right? Privileges and immunities clause. You have the privilege to do it here, you have the privilege to do it there. Okay. Supremacy clause, right? That's another clause that matters. So we'll talk about this in more detail on Thursday with federalism, because that's where federalism deals with the supremacy clause, right? Power at the national government, power at the state government. If the national government says one thing, the state says something else. Supremacy clause says the state wins. Okay. Article 5 is the amendment process. Okay. We created a document. This was our founders' intent. I want to make sure that you understand this. It was our founders' intent that the U.S. Constitution would last from now until forever. Okay. That was their intent. There were actually people back in the day that were like, oh, the Constitution belongs to the living. We should rewrite the Constitution with every generation of people. Bad idea. Okay. One, the more you rewrite it, the less clarity you have in what is and is not constitutional. But we did understand, the founders did understand that you had to create some method for changing, amending, fixing, whatever, right? So we do, but it's not an easy thing to do. It is a two-step process, according to Article 5, to amend the Constitution, right? Number 1 happens at a national level. Number 2 happens at a state level, right? So step 1 is national, step 2 is state, right? And then you've got 2 different ways that we can do this. We can do it with Congress, with a legislative body, or we can do it with the people, right? So the U.S. Congress can pass something and then send it to the state Congresses, and it can become an amendment. The U.S. Congress can pass something and send it to state conventions. That's the people of the state, and then it can become a law. The people can create a national convention and then send it to state legislatures, or a national convention, and it can go to state conventions. Okay? It is worth understanding that literally on the slide, method 1 is 26 out of the 27. Okay? A national convention, 2/3 of the states would have to call for a national convention. Okay? And 2/3 of the states would be 34. Is my math good there? Yeah, that's 68%. Okay, 34. We're somewhere in the 20s right now of states that have active calls in place for a national convention. I'm a big believer in democracy. This is a terrible idea. Okay, a handful of reasons. 1, there's 350 million people in this country. Who are you getting into that convention? How many people you letting into that convention? The more people you let in, that's the more opinions and voices and times of like speak. Good God, if everybody gets to speak, we're going to be there for 3 years, right? Like, and then just so we're crystal clear, if it takes 3 years, who gets to go? Super rich people who don't have to go to work for 3 years. This is not a good idea. Not a good idea. Okay. The other big issue is if in the event that we call a convention at the national level, that national convention can do whatever they want. I do mean whatever they want. They could try to amend the Constitution, or they could just rip it up and say, it's old. We're going to start over. None of the rest of that matters. Okay? There are no limitations placed on that constitution. Okay? Article 7 is ratification. 9 of the 13 states had to ratify, which I always find a little comical, because to ratify an amendment, 3/4 of the states have to ratify. Now, I'm not very good at math, but I can do some basic math. I know that 9 out of 12 is 75%. That's 3/4. So therefore, I know 9 out of 13 is less than 3/4. But it only took 9 to ratify. And I will say, I don't know that it matters. All 13 eventually go on to ratify. But I am always fascinated, and I would love to just have intellectual conversations with other people who sit around and think things like this. What would have happened if a state refused to ratify the Constitution? Would we have forced them? Would we have taken away their statehood and just made them a part of another state? Would we have some sort of like Liechtenstein, like if it was Rhode Island, like Rhode Island's like this big, right? Like would it be like Liechtenstein, where you're just like you just accidentally like walked through an entire country in an afternoon while backpacking Europe because you didn't even realize you were in another country? Like I don't know, maybe. Okay, and then this is the last thing that we need to cover. Okay, the fight for ratification. So we do have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and here's the only thing that I really care that you understand about this, right? Because as we go to create this document, we go to create this founding, we are afraid of tyranny. Okay, and which side, the Federalists who are in favor of the Constitution or the Anti-Federalists who are opposed to the Constitution, which one of those two entities thinks that we're gonna or was worried about tyranny? The Anti-Federalists? Anybody think it could be the Federalists? It is both. It's absolutely both. Okay, but it's just worth understanding where the tyranny comes from, because it's different types of tyranny. Okay, and that's the key. Okay, when you look at the type of tyranny, right? The Anti-Federalists, these are the people that are opposed to this strong national government. They're opposed to the strong national government because they think that the National Congress and the president and the elites are going to become tyrannical, and we're going to have a strong tyrannical national government that's running everything and dictating to our lives. The Federalists are afraid of tyranny of the majority. They're afraid of the tyranny of the quote-unquote unwashed masses of the people. Right? Because it is worth understanding, our founders, we didn't have a word for it yet, but they were afraid of communism. Right? Which if you understand communism, you know that comes from Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century. Right? That's when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. So how, if the Communist Manifesto isn't written until the 19th century, can our founding fathers be afraid of communism in the 18th century? And the answer is the idea still exists, right? The concept that somehow democratically people could just take your property and give it to somebody else via redistributive priorities, right, still exists, right? And when you have a country, right, that is a democratic country, the majority of the people, right, are not going to be super wealthy. They just can't be, right? You cannot have an entire country where everybody is super wealthy. That's not possible, right? And what that means is that if we had tyranny of the majority could go and systematically take that wealth from the sort of 1% or the 10% or whatever you want to call it, okay? And the founders were aware of that, right? And the Federalists, that's the tyranny that they would have feared, right? And then that's it. We're done. So again,